Coming to you live from Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for another episode of Tech Talk with your host, Joey Klein.
All right, well, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Tech Talk. As always, we've got some of the most interesting CEOs of technology companies here in Atlanta. And today we're going to be talking to CEO of BioIQ, Justin Bellante.
How you doing, Joey? Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. I'm glad you're here, Justin. And then we're going to move on to David Excell, CEO of Featurespace.
Hey, Joey. Thanks for having me on this morning.
Absolutely. Okay, so as always, we go alphabetically. We are going to start with Justin. So Justin, we were talking a little bit before this, and it sounds like you have similar child situations. I've got a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old. You've got, I think, a 4-year-old and a 3-month-old.
Yep.
And you also have a company to run, and I'm curious how everything is going, juggling all of that.
Yeah, well, we're obviously with the 3-month-old being very strict with our quarantine at the moment. So I guess that's all on my wife, and she's been doing a fantastic job. Could not focus and grind to the extent that we're grinding without her. Yeah.
So we've got the commonality behind the companies we have in this show, where generally there's an Atlanta story involved. And both your companies have very interesting Atlanta stories, not only moves to Atlanta from different locations because of, business climate, but also really highlighting, I think, two sectors of technology that Atlanta has become really, really good at. One is healthcare. And the other is kind of the intersection of cybersecurity and fintech. Healthcare is where you focus, and so let's start with just a high level what BioIQ is, and then I want to back up and talk a little bit more about how you got to where you did, because it's a little bit of an accident. I think it's an interesting story for everyone to hear.
Yeah, so we're a healthcare technology company, and we're fundamentally disrupting the healthcare testing and immunization space, really by just making it easier for people to access and get all of the routine lab testing that they need and immunizations on an annual basis.
And so what is the challenge here? Is this just life gets in the way, the doctor's office doesn't send you the notice, you forget about it, it doesn't seem as important, it's just in today's day and age when we seem to have more things pulling us in any direction than ever, that this just falls by the wayside for so many people?
Yeah, it's fundamentally one of those aspects of healthcare that just has not evolved and kept pace with consumer expectations in general. And so really it comes down to often a lot of health testing, especially on the preventive side or managing a condition, doesn't get done. Immunizations don't get done. One, because it's not convenient enough for a consumer. Two, because it's not accessible. And that access issue, it's really not only a consumer issue, it's really a social determinants issue. I mean, you have socioeconomics or people that live in certain geographic areas that literally just do not have access to hospitals, physicians, the same type of access we do, especially in major metropolitan areas. So it's a big challenge for certain demographics or certain parts of our population and society.
Sure. I suppose you can look at this as feeding two buckets, right? You've got the convenience factor for people like us on this call who, again, this is a blanket statement, but I'm going to make an assumption, are relatively comfortable and have access to those sort of services. And you've also got it really creating, I guess I would almost look at it like curing a healthcare desert almost, right? If you think of food deserts.
Yeah.
In lower socioeconomic areas, I think you could probably apply the same principle to healthcare and access and time for those sort of activities as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think the food desert and the healthcare desert is a great analogy there. And so finding workflows and delivery models to get care to people, that's a big challenge. And then I think the other challenge is really just making sure that we're getting the right care in the form of the right testing, the right immunization to the right person at the right time.
So how do you go about getting to know a consumer? let's say that we've got someone who doesn't have a lot of medical records, right? Look, if you asked me, I could say, fax you over or email over, medical records from my last 3 doctors, right? If you ask someone who's maybe in this healthcare desert that we're speaking of, probably not as possible. They might not necessarily know, their healthcare background. They might be able to tell you what's going on today, but it might not give you the whole picture. How do you get to know that person who doesn't have a ton of information so that you can properly serve them?
Yeah, great question. So, we primarily sell into B2B channels, so business to business channels. We're selling to health plans to help them manage their population, employers to help them manage their employee population, or to governments, state and federal governments to help them manage populations. And typically when we start, we're getting information, really demographic information from those large organizations on, who needs help. Who's not getting specific type of testing that they need on an annual basis? Where's their quote unquote gap in care? And so with that basic demographic information, we also, we have a lot of data on, having been in business over 15 years, we have data on how people like that in those areas, or people who have similar kind of consumer characteristics, how they have navigated care in the past. And that essentially allows us to, our goal is really to try to understand and predict how they may behave as a consumer, and therefore find the options or fit the care that they need into that consumer behavior. And if we can do that, then instead of, like most healthcare, asking people to change their behavior, which is really a losing strategy, we can actually reinforce behavior. And if we do that, then we're more likely to have successful outcomes. People are more likely to be compliant, get testing because they're acting the way they normally do as a consumer. And they also have a better experience and higher customer satisfaction. If you think about healthcare right now, those are 2 of the biggest challenges, just getting people to be compliant with best practices, but at the same time, creating some level of customer satisfaction that rivals a consumer company or what consumers or what a consumer company would expect.
Sure. I can see this as a win-win on either side, right? Because you serve several different masters here, right? You have the end consumer, you have the business, you have the health plan. It's got to make sense for all parties. And so from the consumer side, convenient, better outcomes. From the business side, right? You're doing something good for your employees. You're hopefully also reducing absenteeism. And from the health plan side, hopefully, that person is, less of an insurance risk over time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we were lucky. Our roots were in, on the consumer side. We started as a direct-to-consumer company. So as we shifted into business to business, we had a lot of those characteristics that you need to be successful at the consumer level, not just the B2B level. But it just so happens that if you're successful at the consumer level and getting people testing and making it easy for them, then at the B2B level, there's a lot of real obvious benefits. And a lot of that comes in the form of long-term cost savings. And that's, of course, just on the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure. You could use that to generalize what we're trying to do in a population.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about roots. You touched upon roots. You don't really have a healthcare background. You came to this via happenstance, life experience, and opportunity. So I'd love to get your journey from what your focus was to why you realized this was such a problem and an opportunity.
Yeah, so my background is really pretty far from healthcare. It's materials science and engineering, which basically is a lot of physics. That's another way to put it. And so I did undergrad and master's work, and then started a PhD at UC Santa Barbara. And about 3.5 years into that PhD, one of my friends and mentors suffered a stroke. And I actually spent time with them and their family in the hospital as they had to debate whether or not to pull the plug, which they ended up doing. We learned over that period of time that he had a case of diabetes for a long period of time that had gone undiagnosed. And that was a contributing factor to the stroke. So I found myself back in grad school thinking about how does one of the smartest people on the planet not get a $25 test that could have potentially saved or prolonged their life. And that was in 2005. And if you think about what was happening for consumers in 2005, one of the major events was the disruption of Blockbuster by Netflix. And as Netflix emerged, it was evident so quickly that Blockbuster was, almost complete. It was foregone conclusion that they were going to be extinct. And so it just became clear to us if consumers can't drive 5 minutes to a video store and rent a video for $5 and bring it home and get the instant gratification of watching that, if that experience no longer works for a consumer, just compare that to what going to the doctor, going to a lab, going back to your doctor, compare that to the average healthcare experience. And so that was the goal. We built the company in Santa Barbara, and we wanted to be, at the time, Netflix for healthcare. But instead of sending DVDs, we wanted to send diagnostics into somebody's home where they could prick their finger, put a couple drops of blood or a urine sample, drop it in the mail. And like Netflix at the time, we built the back-end logistics systems to handle all of that, the integration into a network of labs. And then on the user side, we built, instead of being able to manage your movie preferences, really being able to track and manage your health.
Sure. And this started as something, actually, let me back up for a second. So I think the comparison to the Blockbuster Netflix analogy is quite apt. And at the end of the day, Blockbuster is something fun that you do, right? Going to the doctor.
Exactly.
It is not necessarily a fun activity. It's a necessary one, but it tends to fall by the wayside. In addition to, let's be honest, we're in a system now that basically rewards doctors for churning through as many patients as possible. And anyone who's on this call who has had less than a 30-minute wait time just to see a doctor, I just don't think it exists right now. And so the time suck out of your day. It's frankly, every time I go, I'm shocked, right? No other profession in this country is allowed to make the people who kind of pay them, I guess via their insurance, wait for such a long period of time. It really is set up to fail, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think not only the experience at the doctor, but there's also a bad experience for a doctor if you think about showing up to a doctor's office with really no information other than I have some symptoms. And so what's the first thing your doctor does when you come in? They basically just send you right out the door to go out and get data in the form of diagnostic testing. So if you think about all the energy and the work involved in trying to get you scheduled to show up with your reminders, booked and logged into the system, all of the administrative overhead to create that experience, which usually that first experience with a doctor, especially if it's just for an annual checkup or an annual visit, really they can't do anything on that first visit. It's completely wasted, all that energy and admin. But imagine now, before that, you had actually gone out and got all of your testing, you had all of your data, and you showed up to the doctor's office with a bunch of data about you and your health that's timely, it's relevant, it's what you need. And now everyone who put all that effort into creating that visit, now that physician can actually operate at the top of their license. They can add real value, have a real discussion about, here's your data, here's you, here's my recommendations. And so I think a lot of what we can do is automate and scale that kind of routine testing on an annual basis, even for something as simple as an annual physician visit. And that makes a huge difference in that conversation and really pulls a lot of waste out of the system if you think about what a visit without that data looks like.
Sure, that really is a very relevant point, right? This has to make sense for doctors as well, if you want the entire system to buy in. And look, many doctors are not satisfied with the way the system works, just like patients. So, okay, so you have this idea, and ultimately now where you're at is this is much more of a B2B model, which makes sense, right? You can enter in through organizations and scale to a much wider population than you probably could just starting out as an early stage company from a B2C perspective. So what you're going to, I imagine, is this via HR, as a sort of a benefit to employees? What's the way into an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, given our mission to impact as many lives as possible, we're a mission-driven organization just from our founding story and our spark. And so the best way to have a biggest a big impact from our perspective was to fish with a net, really just to provide these solutions into large populations and leverage the scale of healthcare. And so really we sell into health plans. And when we're selling into health plans, we're selling into a medical director or somebody who's responsible for the health of a population, whether it's their Medicare, Medicaid, or commercial population. And on the employer side, we're typically selling into, as you mentioned, human resources, someone who's responsible for the health, well-being, productivity, and really also somebody who creates the benefits strategy and structure for that population, because a lot of what we can do can help inform that. And also, really connect people into that. If you think about a lot of the benefits an employee has, they don't really take advantage of a lot of those because they don't know they need them. And a lot of what we're doing is going in, helping people get a better understanding of their health, where they have risks, and then connecting in and making better use of those benefits and that structure that your employer is providing for you.
Well, and it's impactful, right? I mean, look, not to say that discounted gym memberships and things of that nature are not appreciated from an employee perspective, but this is something with a little bit more meat on the bone there.
Yeah, something it's data driven, it's clinical, but it's also personalized. So instead of just throwing out a blanket benefit, hey, everyone should eat better and exercise, we all know that. Right. But it certainly helps to be a little more targeted and tailored when you say, why exactly is that? What condition may you have or might you be moving towards? And let's take a very targeted clinical approach to helping you as an individual.
I'm not asking you to name clients at all, but I am curious if you have found commonalities behind the types of organizations that are embracing BioIQ. And that can be sector, that can be region, that can be size. But clearly, it takes a special forward-thinking type of organization to understand the value that this offers. I imagine you've probably, had meetings with some companies that say, we don't really understand why we need you, and others who really get the value and its importance. And I am curious as to the common principles that you have found of those organizations that embrace you.
Yeah, really this population approach, was first engaged on working with health plans on the Medicare Advantage side, that being kind of the cutting edge of healthcare, because those are health plans that are taking responsibility for the overall health and cost of a population. They're very they're based on, they leverage value-based pricing, they get paid for outcomes. And so those were the first health plans, especially on that side, were the first organizations to embrace this type of strategy. We work with over 45 health plans representing over 70% of all the insured lives in the U.S. And those plans represent over 80% of all the Medicare Advantage lives in the U.S. So a lot of progress on the health plan side. And what we've seen is, as you said, progressive and forward-looking employers are really starting to move away from a kind of one-size-fits-all, let's give everybody a gym membership and screen everybody for cholesterol every year, even though they may be 25 years old, and that makes no sense. And let's move towards what health plans are adopting, which is more of a value-based, personalized value-based approach. We have data on individuals. We know, even based upon basic demographics, what type of testing and information they need on an annual basis. So let's target and tailor these solutions to them, even on a population level. So I think if you think about the employers that are doing that, typically it's Fortune 500, Fortune 100. They have a lot of resources that can, that are interested in investing in their population and can help manage and design these types of programs. But it's really not limited to that. I think it's, organizations of any size and in any industry have kind of that progressive mentality. Some of it really just comes down to the culture of the organization.
Sure.
And, do they invest in their people, and and where do they value their people?
I'd like to move backward for a second and touch upon kind of how you got to Atlanta, because you've bounced around a little bit. You're not a native. And this just touches into kind of what Atlanta has become from a healthcare IT perspective. So if you could elaborate upon that, please.
Yeah, so starting a company in Santa Barbara is great. It's a it's a beautiful place. It's a great place to start, but it's a very difficult place to scale a business. And when you scale a business, you really need access to a lot of talent, especially in the kind of manager, director, VP level. And so, very different from your kind of core startup founding team versus a scaled company. And we were fortunate to have some early customers, large customers in Atlanta. And we actually opened an office here in 2014 due to two factors. One, we had customers here. And two, Atlanta is really a healthcare IT hub. There's over 200 healthcare IT companies in Atlanta. So just a very rich talent pool and, a pool that essentially allowed us to scale rapidly. And so we really kind of grew that office in Atlanta between 2014 and 2019. And ultimately, it made more sense that the majority of our employees were here versus California. We had better access to talent here, better economics around running and managing a business in Georgia versus California, and so we made that move in January of 2019.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Now, look, I've actually had a couple days of business in Santa Barbara, and it is amazing to look out at the ocean. But a little bit of not the most robust business environment as a whole.
Yeah, very, very high quality of life, but also very high cost of living.
Yeah, that too. Well, look, this was fantastic. So, if anyone listening, either from a health plan or an organization, wants to reach out to you to learn more about BioIQ, what is the best way to find you?
Yeah, best way to find us is www.bioiq.com. We'll take it from there.
All right, Justin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Joey.
Okay, Dave, how you doing over there?
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so we've got somewhat of a similar story in a move to Atlanta, as well as kind of a focus on what Atlanta is good at. But let's start off and give the headline for everyone of who is Featurespace and what problem do you target?
So we're an enterprise financial crime software company. So we provide solutions to banks, financial institutions, and payment companies to help them prevent fraud and also identify suspicious activity, which is likely to be potential money laundering activity. So underneath that is a software platform that's able to process transactions and interactions of customers when they interact with their bank to help understand that behavior, and then use that to stop and identify those types of transactions. So we use machine learning to be able to identify those behaviors.
Okay, so this is something that financial institutions would use to essentially, for lack of a better term, monitor seems big brotherish, but I guess it sort of is monitoring. Monitor customer transactions to understand if anything is odd is going on, both to benefit customers and any sort of odd activity on their account, but also the institution of itself, if there is some pattern, a greater pattern that's being experienced across the network.
Exactly. So we're ultimately trying to protect the consumers. So we're looking at understanding what your good behavior is when you interact with your bank or when you spend on your credit card, to then identify unusual transactions from what is your typical behavior, and then either decline those transactions so that the fraudster is not able to run away with your money, or also to help make sure that those financial institutions are being compliant with the regulation.
Okay. So the times when anyone listening to this has either probably gotten a text or a phone call or an email of suspicious activity on their credit card, oftentimes it's actually pretty accurate. The software and data that goes into generating that alert response would be essentially something akin to what Featurespace is offering.
Yeah, exactly. So it's either that or it's potentially, sometimes there's the unfortunate situation when it really is you and you're trying to buy something and you get declined. So that's what we're trying to continually optimize, is that getting that positive experience where we are identifying suspicious and bad activity, while also making sure when you are genuinely using your card, we don't block or add any friction into that process.
Okay, so clearly a play for financial institutions. What about big brands? And look, obviously all, big brands where you can, transact with them online clearly have payment processing systems behind that and interact with financial institutions as well. But I'm just curious if there is technology that you provide that is useful on the front end of that transaction to a brand as well.
No, definitely. So we have a partnership with Worldpay. So Worldpay is one of America's largest payment providers to merchants. So those are both brick and mortar merchants and also online merchants. So we help those organizations screen the transactions as they come in to help identify fraud or put in controls before they then take that transaction and send it across into the payment schemes and then ultimately into the bank that issued your credit card to ask if you have the available money and if that transaction should then be authorized by them.
Okay. So before you existed and before, before other competitors of yours that claim to do the same thing existed, what did a financial institution do? Is this all humans basically tracking consumer behavior, trying to identify some sort of pattern? How did this work before we had technology?
I guess ultimately that's where it began, but probably going back into the 1970s, 1980s, as it was all looking at paper-based transactions and trying to identify if that was legitimately you, or looking at signatures on checks to see did it match the signature on file and was that going through. And then I guess there's been a big progression from then to automate that whole experience. So then it migrated from those basic checks to then starting to implement, I guess, the most basic form of AI, which is looking at rules. So it was looking at fraud that had taken place in the past, trying to identify a rule that would describe that fraudulent activity. So it may be the transaction value was over $1,000, could be a likely fraudulent transaction. So payment companies and banks would implement rules, and all of the transactions that met that characteristic were then flagged for either declined or they were investigated. And then what we, I guess, continually see is that fraudsters become more innovative. They see how they're being blocked and they change their behavior. So then a lot of fraud systems then transition to using machine learning, where you're looking at the fraud that's taken place in the past, and then you're trying to essentially correlate that to what happened in those previous transactions. So it's almost trying to then optimize those rules to identify that bad activity. And I guess, so the key difference that we've made at Featurespace is that we learned that fraudsters continue to innovate. They're looking to dodge all the systems that are in place. So rather than learn fraudulent behaviors, we decided to learn good customer behavior, because us as individuals, we're relatively repetitive in terms of how we use our payment products. So we wanted to learn the profile of the consumer and understand what good activity looked like for us as individuals, and then really flag the anomalies and unusual trends from that. So that enabled us to be much more accurate at predicting fraud, but also being reactive to new types of fraud. So not just relying on fraud that had happened in the past. When there's a new fraud scam or scheme that's been identified, our systems are very quick at being able to identify those and then protect the bank and the payments companies.
Well, what this makes me think of is, if you remember the movie Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo DiCaprio, and he's this incredible con man. And, he just goes from location to location. They can't catch him. Finally, of course, the FBI catches up with him. And he essentially gets, starts helping them, right? To think like a criminal and understand things that they might not be able to see as, law-abiding FBI agents. And so, look, you said, yes, we look at customers and what their good behaviors are. I get that part. But as you've established and we both know, criminals consistently innovate. It's incredible how much they innovate, right? And so I would imagine that your technology needs to consistently be on the cutting edge of what is possible from a financial crimes perspective. But you, not being a financial criminal, how do you truly understand what is possible? How do you get inside and the mind of and keep up to date with what can truly go wrong?
So I guess there's two elements to that. Is really understanding, I guess, the ecosystem that exists for the criminal out there. And I guess a lot of existing systems are very much focused on single points of contact, so single interactions with your credit card, rather than looking at the full interaction between the customer and their bank. So what happens when you first open your account, or what happens when you contact the call center? So where are all the vulnerabilities that exist, and how do you layer that information in? So if someone is potentially social engineered at a call center that enables them to reissue a card or change your address, you want to factor that into your decisions when you're looking at a new payment coming through. So part of it is sort of looking at all those vulnerable areas. But then also we have a very strong subject matter expert team that have either worked in banks or financial institutions and helped be on the front line in fighting the fraud and reading lots of information, looking on the dark web, trying to do the research and trying to understand what the criminals are out there doing and how they're thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So you don't have a reformed fraudster on your staff, but you do have a team that is consistently enmeshing themselves in that world as legally as possible.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's rewind a little bit. So, okay, obviously we understand what the need for this type of technology is, right? We live in a world in which, most of us don't even carry around cash anymore. Everything is put your credit card in a, online portal and transact that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Paper money might not even well exist. Money at this point is essentially ones and zeros. Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously the need for it makes sense. The question is, why are you the guy to solve it? Why is your company the one to solve it?
I guess it's a great question, and we almost got here by accident. We didn't start a company and say we were going to be a fraud prevention company. When I was doing my PhD in research, I was really interested in how you could use machine learning and statistics to describe our behaviors and behaviors from more of a physical context. So I often use the analogy as if you were sitting in a coffee shop or a bar and you were looking at people that were passing by very quickly. You could say who was a local, who was a business person going to a meeting, probably not as usual in the current day and age, or who was lost and late. So you could look at how they were interacting in that environment by their behavior. So it was, how could we teach a machine to be able to have that same interpretation? And then we started looking at how people were interacting in computer games to be able to identify if they were human players or robotic players, to differentiate and make sure that there was a fair playing field there. And then we got introduced to the online gaming and gambling industry, where they also had a similar problem of identifying fraud. And it was really through that evolution is that we then said, well, there was a great application to understanding the good consumer to identify the bad, and being able to do that very accurately to both make sure good customers weren't impacted, but were able to accurately identify that fraud.
And so was your research as a PhD the spark to begin Featurespace? And did Featurespace essentially then begin as in the gaming industry and evolve from there?
Exactly. Yep. That's how we began.
Okay. And your story is a cross-Atlantic one. So Featurespace has a Atlanta as well as a UK presence, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So I was doing my PhD at the University of Cambridge over in the UK, and that's still where I guess a majority of our R&D team is. But then we moved over to Atlanta about 3 years ago.
Okay. And let's hear the Metro Atlanta Chamber pitch, just as Justin told it to us. What you looked at, I'm sure, a number of large metros in the States, right? And from a country like the UK, I think probably what's top of mind is initially a place like a San Francisco or New York. So again, I'm not bashing Atlanta. I love it, right? But why this southern city that, maybe is not at the top of the gateway cities of the country list?
So for us, I guess a similar explanation was our customers. So we had previously, I started working with TSYS. So TSYS is one of the largest credit card processors in the United States, where they work with a lot of financial institutions to actually run the infrastructure that provides that banking service. So we had started working with TSYS. And so that's a great reason to start to identify a city to work with. And then when we did look out at other potential customers, and Atlanta having the term transactionality, where there's a massive proportion of US payments are processed through companies that have significant presence here in Atlanta, that also made perfect sense for us. And then looking at other characteristics like there's only a 5-hour time difference to the UK versus 8 going over to the West Coast, and having the airport to be able to travel across the US made perfect sense for us.
Yeah. Look, you're preaching to the choir here. It is, I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Mayor Hartsfield for thinking about this 60 years ago.
No, definitely.
Yeah. So all of us go about our daily lives. We hand out our personal information as if it's our phone number, right? We have all become so used to probably doing things we shouldn't, right? Sending a credit card number over text, taking a picture of your credit card and sending it to someone, buying things on an unsecured network at a coffee shop. I mean, it's just our daily lives are probably a crash course in how not to protect your financial assets, and in turn, the financial institutions with which you work. So, what do you see as the most glaring bad behaviors of consumers these days, and what does it take for us to fix them, or do we just have to rely on Featurespace to, catch us before we fall?
I guess like some of it is around the sharing of information. So being able to look on LinkedIn or Facebook and identify when someone's birthday is often one of those key questions that gets asked when someone is trying to authenticate you.
Didn't even think about that, but that's so true. Yeah.
Like when you first ring up the bank, they'll often ask, when is your date of birth? And so then that becomes an easy one. And also we did a survey, I think it was 18 months ago, and we looked at, and one of the questions that we asked is, do you use the same password for your bank that you also use for social media? And there was a surprising number of people that said yes to that. So just using something like a password manager, it's almost impossible to remember all the hundreds of different passwords we need for all of our different accounts. But using something like that to have unique passwords, especially for important accounts like your banking account or your credit card account, is really important.
Yeah, no, you're hitting too close to home right now. What are the next couple of years for Featurespace? So, I mean, look, clearly you're working with some of the largest institutions in this field to try and solve what is really a never-ending problem, right? It's not like some companies have the goal of almost like ceasing to exist, right? It's like, I solved this problem, then it's done. My goal is to not be here, okay? This will never go away. So is this just, we need to impact as many institutions and consumers as possible? Or is there some additional, wish list of business lines or industries that you haven't really fully infiltrated yet that you really want to?
I think for us, there's an enormous potential to grow. So there's a few factors to that. Is a lot of the infrastructure inside banks is going through modernization. So often when we think of the front end of banks, as they look relatively high tech, but behind the scenes is they're still upgrading a lot of their systems and act as silos. But so it's working with those organizations to bring their data together so that they can be more effective in making decisions. But then also at the same time is we're seeing a huge amount of innovation in the payments system. So going, especially here in the US, with the migration to the chip and what's called EMB, to now more contactless payments with Apple Pay and Google Pay, those changes in how those transactions work creates new opportunities both for us, but also for the fraudster. As some of that security increases, they're looking for other ways to penetrate and break into that network. At the same time, we're looking at, I guess, what's from an ACH payment, which is something in terms of moving money from bank account to bank account, is typically either next day or same day over a number of hours, is moving to a real-time payment stream. So again, that creates opportunities for fraudsters to be able to move money around much faster than they have before. So the banks need to improve their operational process to be able to respond in real time at the time at which those payments are being made. So those, we see the industry move, and also this, similar to what you said before, is the job of a fraudster has got easier. There is so much good data available on the dark web for them to be able to purchase relatively cheaply, sure, that it makes our job even harder.
Well, have you had to change your business or technology much to deal with the proliferation of applications such as Venmo or the Cash App, or has the capabilities behind those forms of payment been pretty consistent? Obviously, PayPal's been around for a while. Yes, those two are a little bit different, but the principle is generally the same. Is it just simply that more people are using it now than ever before, or has something fundamentally changed about that technology that has meant that Featurespace needs to shift a little bit?
So I guess that almost to our advantage of starting in the United Kingdom, where payment technology there is probably a few years ahead, because there's less organizations involved to be able to make those modernizations change. So things like contactless payments, the chips on the card, and also online transactions were much more prevalent in the UK ahead of the US. So that gave us an advantage when we were moving across here, because we had already seen a lot of those transitions to be able to help the financial industry here in the US learn from those lessons and not make the same mistakes.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense when you sort of think about the differences in how those technologies developed.
Yeah, especially in the UK, where you've got a handful of major banks, where in the US you're looking at thousands up to tens of thousands of individual banks. So there's a different way in terms of how the financial institutions work with each other to enable those new technologies.
That is true. So, I mean, yes, obviously you have your big national banks here, you have your big state banks, but you're also, the number of small community banks that are around and probably not close to modernized is almost infinite. Are those business models and those type of organizations and the number of consumers that they serve, is that somewhat incompatible with Featurespace's technology? Or can you go after something as small as a community bank?
So I guess not directly. So our approach there has to be working with the technology providers that work with those organizations. So when they are buying a service to process a bill or to make a payment, is we can work in the background on those systems to provide those fraud services. So that's where we look at a lot of the large fintech-based businesses that are here in Atlanta, like a Fiserv or an FIS or a Jack Henry. Those types of organizations provide those services to the smaller banks, and being able to work with organizations like that really then helps to make sure that really modern technology creates an even playing field from a fraud perspective, from the perspective of the top 5 banks all the way down to the small regional banks and the small single town banks as well.
Okay, that all makes sense. So look, for anyone listening, financial institution, brand, payment processor, they want to learn more about Featurespace, what's the best way to do that?
So the easiest way is to go to our website. So similar to before, it's featurespace.com, or look me up on LinkedIn, and happy to provide more information. Okay.
Dave, Justin, thanks a lot for coming on, guys.
Thanks, Joey. It's a pleasure to be on.
Thanks, Joey.
Sure thing. And everyone else, thank you for listening to Tech Talk, and we'll see you soon.